Before we get into the stories, if you come for the first time, please like and subscribe. We need your support. Please share these stories. Thanks. A couple years back, I lived in a quiet neighborhood which had a big patch of unkempt woods connected to it. This was in North Dakota, by the way, and my house was located in a more desolate area than the town. Usually I had nothing to do with the woods, but sometimes I would cut through them to get home quickly. The area in general was quite safe, so it was never a problem until the local teens began talking about this stalker living in the forest. It sounded like a bunch of nonsense, but slowly, cases of minor theft were happening all too often. The things stolen were so strange that the town sheriff considered it more of a prank than anything. From gardening tools to laundry left outside to dry, these incidents were quickly becoming a nuisance. 2 of my bed sheets were also stolen actually, so it became a rule to never leave laundry outside to dry after sundown. Then it was the local trash cans and dumpsters that were being messed with. Many people would wake up to their trash strewn about on the street, yet no one was ever caught. Even the naughtiest of kids wouldn't go dumpster diving just for some laughs, so clearly someone else was behind all this. It was a humid day when I was heading home from work. I was part of the admin team in the local high school. It was so close to me that on most days I walked there. I certainly wished that I had my car on that hot day, as I decided to cut through the woods to get home as soon as possible. These were relatively safe woods with no dangerous wildlife inhabiting them. At most, one might encounter a flighty fox or see a snake coiled under a pile of leaves. If you stuck to the rough trail, then the worst you had to ward off were the mosquitoes. I was on edge that day once I was in the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder, constantly feeling like I was being followed. I didn't have much cash on me and my phone was as old as a relic, so a potential thief was in for some disappointment. I whirled around at once when I heard rustling on my side. I could only blink in surprise seeing a person standing there, wearing one of those cheap plastic masks depicting a tiger. The mask was filthy and the person was also dressed in a strange Roman-style dress. It took me a moment to realize that they were wearing a bedsheet. This was such a surreal sight that I chuckled awkwardly. I gave the person a "you got me" look, thinking it to be some strange joke, but they just stood there in the bushes. Eerily still, their dark eyes assessing me like how a predator watches its prey. Stepping out the bushes, they raised their hands, which was when my dread settled in for good. They held broken halves of a rusty garden shear in each hand, the blade sharp enough to stab a person to death. The speed with which they charged at me was horrifying. I screamed and ran as fast as I possibly could. Instead of heading home, I changed paths to cut into the town, the killer staying only a few paces behind me. They managed to slash at my back twice, my shirt getting torn and sticking to me due to my blood. It was my luck that when I burst out upon the town street, a few people were there. They saw this killer run back into the forest and helped me get to a hospital. I ended up getting sticks for the deep cuts on my back and tetanus shots. I still have scars from the cuts to this day. The killer also broke into my home and took out all their rage there, as I later learned. I lived alone without any pets, so no lives were lost at least. Alarm was high in town and the police worked overtime to comb through the forest. They found a makeshift camp made with most of the stolen items. I was chilled to the bone when I found this out, horrified that it wasn't just a stalker but an actual killer living in the town's woods. This killer tried to kidnap a young boy a week after chasing me, but thankfully, the kid's father and uncle were burly, brave men who caught the maniac. He was arrested and is still in jail from what I know. I sold my old home, however. The trauma of this incident is still strong to the point that I can't even bear parks with too many trees. You never know who's watching you from among greenery. When I was 9, I lived near the woods with my parents and older brother. Our house was nothing too grand, but it was cozy enough with a sturdy fence separating our backyard from the forest beyond. Apart from an army of all kinds of insects in the summer, it wasn't so bad living right next to a dense forest. My brother is only 3 years older than me, so of course, we weren't allowed to go play in the woods until my brother was at least 17. Looking back, I think it was a very wise decision on our parents' part. The story I'm sharing happened in January when everything was covered in a heavy blanket of snow. Our parents had to leave town for a week since one of Dad's cousins was pretty sick. In their place, our Aunt Sally was going to stay with us. She also lived in town and was literally our favorite aunt with how she had no problem letting us stay up late to play video games. During this particular week, I jolted awake in the dead of the night hearing weird shuffling from outside. It sounded like someone was raking something against our house, standing right below my window. Being only 9, I was too scared to get up but managed after a little while. All I caught by then was a dark blur quickly going round the corner, still in our backyard. I dismissed it as some wild animal even though my mind kept reminding me that this shadow seemed to be running on 2 feet. Like a person. It was unfortunate that it snowed at dawn, so by the time I had a chance to check outside, there was no sign of anyone being in our backyard. My older brother was also being a grump about how cold it was and stayed cooped up inside, hogging the only surviving controller we had to play the new Sonic game. I was just playing outside on my own when I found something very odd. A half footprint belonging to a proper boot. Probably that of a man with how big it was. It was very close to the house, right below my bedroom's window actually. Recalling that scraping noise, I also leaned closer to the concrete wall, but the paint there was already in need of a fresh coat, hence I couldn't find anything weird. Still, my brother and I were too young and our dad wasn't home. Whose footprint was that? For the next 2 days, nothing happened, but I simply didn't feel comfortable outside alone. I always felt this heaviness on my back as if the tall trees surrounding one side of our house were boring holes into me. That same scraping and shuffling sound woke me again another night. I realized that it was also snowing outside, so clearly whoever it was, they were pretty smart. I kept wondering who or even what was this stranger outside. What did they want? Naturally, I told all of this to Aunt Sally the first thing in the morning. She took my word very seriously and notified the town sheriff. Although, when she and I took a look outside, we didn't find anything other than some smudged dirt marks again below my window. The day before Mom and Dad were supposed to return, my brother and I were having a snowball fight outside. Aunt Sally had very strictly told us to stay far away from the fence and was also checking up on us from time to time. It was my brother who noticed it and went near the fence. I began to call out for him, but he immediately glared at me to be quiet, so I timidly followed him instead. There were these dried crusty marks on the snow as well as the fence. It was so cold that there was no weird smell, but I could tell from their rusty dark color that this was blood. Freaked out, my brother and I were about to go back inside when a bush near our fence outside moved. It all happened so fast, but I guess Aunt Sally had been staying extra vigilant. She pulled us boys back and held out a kitchen knife at the filthy man who had tried to lunge at us. He had tried to snatch me actually, since I was the younger skinner one. He snarled at Aunt Sally, but she made it clear that she wasn't messing around with that knife, so he dashed back into the woods. The sheriff was called, and after 2 whole weeks, the man was finally arrested. Later, after this harrowing experience, I tend to stay far away from forests in general. My name is Brian, and I'm a mycologist. For research purposes, I was staying at my rustic cottage right in the middle of a forest when this happened. It was 2006 in the month of March, when spring is right around the corner. I was looking for a certain species of mushrooms I knew were likely to pop up in the season, so I would go on long treks in the serene woods almost every single day. For context, it had been a good 3 years since I visited my humble cottage, and during that time, I came across a number of rather strange rumors about the place. Of course, they sounded so outrageous half the time that I dismissed them as exaggerated urban legends. All these stories came rushing back to me one day deep in the forest when I found a strange mark etched into all the surrounding trees. I realized that I was standing in a circular clearing with these marked trees all around. It was the same symbol, like a rune. Sure, people etch all sorts of things on trees, but this gave me a chill. Even the gun I had with me for safety felt inadequate. Now that I had seen this weird mark, I began to notice more and more odd things in the woods around me. Bundles of sticks tied up to match that rune, more etchings, and even a cluster of footprints as if a whole crowd had passed through. It put me on edge. Imagine my utter terror when in the middle of the night I nearly fell off my bed from the loud knocking on my main door. I grabbed my gun and quietly went outside, but just as I got near the door I heard the sound of someone running followed by rustling of the nearby bushes. I did not open the door. In fact, I stuck the heavy dining table against it, the whole cottage feeling flimsy to me in that moment. The next day, I warily opened my door and took comfort from the bright sunlight. There was a bundle on the doorstep. It smelled so awful that I nearly threw up right then and there. Made of sticks, fur, innards of animals and literal feces, it seemed like some arcane relic left as a surprise for me. Since someone had knocked on my door last night, I was clearly meant to find this. Was it a prank? Who would play a prank on me in the middle of a forest? I don't even want to think about how disgusted I was when getting rid of that vile thing. It almost fell apart when I pushed it with a broomstick, leaving a stinky snail trail on my doorstep that I had to wash off afterwards. Clearly, I was not alone, and so I notified the rangers to send someone to pick me up. To my dismay, they said that it would take them at least 2 days to get to me. There had been a forest fire somewhere, so of course that took priority. That night, I stayed awake from the distant ominous chanting I heard. It seemed to travel all around my cottage, but thankfully, never came too close. I also couldn't understand a single word as it sounded made up of odd syllables. From loud howls to animalistic screeches, I was experiencing a nightmare with waking eyes. The next day, I found a giant red X on my front door. I was on edge from seeing this, noting more runes made from bundles of sticks strewn about my defenseless abode. Mycology was the last thing on my mind as I kept my firearm on me at all times, eagerly waiting for those rangers to get me out. It absolutely angered me that bringing a car this deep in the forest wasn't allowed, yet it was this unsafe of a place. Clearly, I was dealing with a crazed cult who had set their eyes on me. Just as the sun went down that day, I heard feverish chanting take over the woods around me. It sounded like a sizable group, and this time, they were coming closer and closer by the minute. And then gunshots. I heard loud cursing before someone banged on my door. It was one of the rangers. 5 of them had come actually, having realized that it was this crazy cult who caused the forest fire the other day. The man also apologized to me for taking this long to fetch me. While the cultists ran away to hide in the forest, I did catch sight of a few fleeting eyes glaring at me. Crazed, hateful eyes. The forest was sealed off, and from what I later heard, the government got involved, but either way, I've never felt safe in any woods since then.